All right, welcome to another amateur history hour where we're so good we actually do it in less than an hour. Welcome to the second show here, Ivor. This time it's your turn actually to talk to me and tell me a little bit more, and surprise me maybe with some kind of history that I don't know about. Maybe I do. But that's the whole idea of this show is just two guys who like history, rediscovering history together. With that said, let's kick it off. Off to you,
Yeah.
Ivor.
So just to be clear, one of the things that we're going to do with this channel is try to come up with a topic that the other guy hasn't heard about. So for my first topic, I have this old newspaper here. Oh, let me see here. It's called Harper's Weekly. It was out when the Civil War was going on. So I wanted to start by reading this article because mainly it covers the Civil War, but it also has like world news and stuff in it. So this is something while the Civil War was going on, this also happened. As a short article, I'll just read here in the foreign news section. And in case anybody wants to check out this source, it's Harper's Weekly, a journal of civilization, number 351. So the issue is 351. Okay, so attack on American and British vessels. So I read this and I just was like, I got to find out more about this. So, news from Japan of a highly important character to the 24th of July is received by way of San Francisco. Actual hostilities between the Japanese and the treaty powers had commenced on the 15th day of July. An English ship bound from Nagasaki to Kanagawa by an inland passage was fired upon by Japanese forts and vessels, which had previously fired upon the American ship Pembroke. She was much injured and had 4 men killed and 6 wounded. Subsequently, the American steamer Wyoming visited the place to punish the Japanese for firing upon the Pembroke. She blew up one Japanese steamer and sunk another, and silenced nearly all the neighboring forts. She received 20 shots and had 5 men killed and 6 wounded. The forts were afterward attacked by 2 British war vessels, and after a bombardment, a detachment of British troops were landed, who destroyed the fortifications and an adjacent village. The Japanese showed very little fight. So, when I first heard of this, I was like, well, I guess, our government was being a busybody, like a warmonger, even back then, just wars all over the world. But there actually is a reason for this war. It wasn't an unprovoked attack. So, first of all, before I go into that, like my research, what do you think about that one?
So you think this is something that the U.S. should have stayed out of or could have stayed out of potentially?
When I first read this article, I thought, the Civil War is going on. Why are you guys sending ships to fight in the Pacific? Like, isn't the Confederacy a big enough deal? And you also have to remember that the way they were beating the Confederacy was by surrounding it by sea, in part. That was called the Anaconda Plan. So I was just wondering, why are they doing this? I mean, I could see our government today doing it because they like to send troops all over the world, in different parts of the world, for no reason that they can explain to regular people. But actually, so I researched it, and actually there was a good reason for this battle. So, um, let's see.
So what was the U.S. doing over there?
Okay, so what was the U.S. doing over there? So the United States, or at least Oliver Perry, opened up Japan and forced them to start trading with other countries. And there were a lot of other countries that were trading there, including the United States. And
to know who was the first country to trade with Japan?
I'm guessing it. I would guess probably the Netherlands.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, this the Japanese, they also fired on a Dutch ship. It was called the Medusa. So
Yeah,
Mhm.
the Dutch were there for quite some time, but they had to stay on a separate island. They weren't allowed to go onto the mainland, and then the Japanese would send like geishas over and try and get intelligence about the Dutch. But
They
yeah,
got to send geishas with alcohol if that's their job, if that's what they're trying to do.
Yeah. So anyway, so yeah, no, but I would love to hear more about what the Americans were doing there. I know they forced the market open, which is an interesting story as well. Like, why do you have to force open a market? I mean, right? I mean, if they want to their market, let them be, right?
Well, that's a very 20th or 21st century kind of libertarian attitude, which really wasn't part of the main thought process back then. I mean, they were lucky that they didn't get carved to pieces like China did. But, so here's what happened. There's an emperor. His name was Komei. And, like, when the shogun agreed to open up Japan, the emperor didn't agree. Now, unlike China, Japan has one imperial family. They don't have different dynasties. But what happens is, throughout a lot of their history, the emperor is just a figurehead. It doesn't have any power. It's like a shogun or some other type of nobility that's really running things, and the emperor is just a figurehead. But sometimes, every once in a while, the emperors would try to reassert their authority. And so this dude, Komei, he didn't like how Japan was opened up. So he gave some order, and it was called something like the order to expel all barbarians. In other words, get rid of all the foreigners out of Japan. And there was one guy who actually obeyed the emperor. Let's see, his name was Mōri, and he was from this clan called the Chōshū clan. And they were responsible for this area called the Shimonoseki Straits. And this dude took it upon himself to expel all the foreigners. So he fired on the Pembroke, which was an American merchant ship. Like, they didn't know what was going on. They were just going there business as usual, and this dude started shooting at them. So eventually they escaped, and when they got to wherever it was they were going, they filed a complaint, and the United States sent the USS Wyoming. And then there was a battle between the Wyoming and this Chōshū guy, and they sunk two of his ships, and then they blasted his forts, and then they also fired over the forts to damage some of the cities that were nearby. But then they got, like the article says, they took a bunch of shots, so they had to leave. And later on, there's a...
What year was this? Just what year did this take place?
1863.
1863. Okay.
Yeah. So the Civil War was raging over here, and then that dude was raging over there, Lord Mōri.
I had never heard of this before, ever. I knew Japan had a big naval battle with Russia, I think in the early 1900s. Which won.
Yeah, I think Meiji Emperor, the Meiji guy was there. I'm not sure about that. I'll have to look that up. Okay. Yeah, I think Teddy Roosevelt brokered that peace between Russia and Japan, but this was before that. This dude, he kept attacking ships. He attacked ships that were like coming in and bringing the ambassadors to Japan. He attacked a Dutch frigate called the Medusa and a French ship called the Qiancheng. I'm not even sure if I pronounced that right. But he was picking a fight with all the foreigners, basically. And eventually what happens is the United States, like after this thing where the Wyoming comes and shells him a bit, the United States teams up with France, England, Netherlands, and they all go and attack as a group. And they beat this guy into submission. And then the Emperor, Komei, he dies when he's like 35 years old. He hasn't lived very long. So, as far as I know, like, they were the only, this Chōshū, this Lord Mōri guy from the Chōshū clan, is the only one who tried to implement that order. and it's called the Battle of Shimonoseki Straits. So that's going on while Civil War is going on over here. But think about that. It took 4 countries to shut down this one warlord: France, England, Netherlands, and the United States. They sent a
That's
combined
interesting
fleet.
because I don't think Japan started modernizing its navy until later, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, their technology was a little bit behind that of their opponents. Like they had some
Okay.
older ships and some older guns. And also, Civil War is when they started making metal ships to fight.
Yeah, and,
But
and I imagine that the Confederates weren't much of a naval threat. Is that why they were able to spare these ships to go off and fight this remote battle?
so that's what I was thinking is, why are they sparing ships to go off and fight this battle when they're fighting with the Confederates? But I guess, from what I've seen, I would say that the United States already had a presence over in the Pacific because they were trying to protect their trade with that part of the world.
Yeah, which
And
is, like pirates and things like that, right? That's something that is also why the UK, United Kingdom, had such a, or I should really say, um, the empire, the British Empire, had such a large navy because they had trade ships everywhere that needed to be protected, right? So that's also why the U.S. today has the largest navy in the world, because it's the number one economic superpower, and you
yeah,
need to be able to protect yourself against pirates, like like Somalian pirates, for example. But those are not new; they've been around for centuries.
right. And this guy wasn't even a pirate. He was the legitimate, like, local ruler.
So
But
do you think this had like an impact on how Japan perceived the West as a threat? Or I wonder about that, right? Like what made Japan attack the Americans? I guess that's a whole different story altogether. And I mean, Pearl Harbor, right? They knew that America was going to be an enemy at some point, and
so,
that, yeah. Sorry, go
okay,
ahead.
so to answer your question, um, in the case of Pearl Harbor, America really was a threat, and their logic was, that if we could knock out their most important naval base, like it wasn't just ships at Pearl Harbor, it was also airplanes. Like they bombed the airfields and the ships. They were trying to cripple the United States before it got into the war, and it almost worked. Now this, though, the difference between this and that is that this Shimonoseki Straits battle was not authorized by the government because the shogun was like the actual authority, and the emperor was just the symbolic, or the figurehead, and he was kind of, I mean, how do you explain? Like he's a figurehead. He's in charge, like the national symbol or whatever, but he's not the actual authority. He's just a symbol. But he was trying to exert his actual authority. He said, I want all the foreigners out of Japan. I never agreed to let them in. And this is one guy who took him seriously and carried out the order.
Hmm.
And he just started firing on all the foreign ships. He didn't care.
Kind of like that.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
yeah, it took 3 countries to take out this one dude.
Yeah, and,
So,
and was it just tactics, I guess, or I don't know, like how was he able to do that?
because he didn't just have ships, he also had forts with cannons and stuff. I guess the cannons were aimed towards the sea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting story. I had never heard of it. If you think of the Civil War, um, yeah, you always think of like big land battles, right, where they just shoot at each other with old muskets and their
Cannons.
cavalry and things like that. At least that's the picture I get. But I have to say that the Civil War, like I understand it's a really big topic in the U.S., but outside of the U.S., it's not so much. But then
And
again,
actually, there were a lot of sea battles as well in the Civil War. And the Confederates, though they didn't have nearly as much manpower or equipment, they created the world's first, well, not the world's first submarine, but the first military submarine to successfully sink an enemy ship. It's called the H.L. Hunley. They also created the first metal ships. I forget what the names of those were, but they did it by they raised some wooden ships that were already sunk. I don't know how you raise a ship in the 1800s, but they raised them back up and they plated them in metal, and so they created the first metal warships. And this Lord Mōri guy somehow, or maybe it was the guy that came after him, but somehow they raised one of those ships that was sunk and used it again.
Yeah, I mean that's very interesting because I mean the South, the Confederates, they were outnumbered, right? So they had to find different ways. Like they couldn't just throw more men into the battle because then they would lose. So they would have to try and get these sneaky or guerrilla type warfare methods. I heard about the submarine. You know, these daring attempts that you see those also like for example with the Germans at the end of the Second World War, where they, you know, was becoming pretty evident that they were losing, and then they were trying all these experimental weapons to try and tip the battle in their favor. But yeah, it's very interesting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's all I had, unless you want to say anything else about that or bring anything else to the table.
No, I mean, in general, it's a topic I would love to hear more about, the Civil War, because honestly, I don't really know all that much about it, other than from what I've seen on TV. So yeah, I didn't know about that. Didn't even think about, you know, that you would have that second front. And I'm also just really fascinated by Japan in general and how they've maintained that whole, you know, separatist or isolated approach, which they've had from the beginning. When the Dutch got there, you know, and how they had this mantra at one point where they would try to colonize like parts of Asia, but really it wasn't. Again, it was from that same thinking of like we gotta strike first just to keep the foreigners out, that kind of idea. Anyway, I find it fascinating. So
Annexed Korea all together.
yeah, yeah. No, thanks, man. I really appreciate the story. If anybody has any other questions or suggestions about this episode, previous episode, or maybe you want to hear about a specific topic, just drop them down in the comments and just tag either Ivor or myself, Cyril, and let us know what you wanna hear about. And thanks so much for listening. Appreciate it.